back to today's video. Today is Thursday, August 7th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the Georgia Senate race and the Georgia Republican Party as they head into what they determined to be a fearful Republican primary, a three-way race against Derek Dooley, the former coach of the Tennessee Volunteers, Mike Collins, and Buddy Carter, two incumbent U.S. representatives from the state of Georgia, all going against each other in a hyper-competitive 2026 Republican primary. Now, the Georgia GOP has had their fair share of primaries. Governor Brian Kemp came into office in 2018 after an exceptionally competitive Republican primary against the then Lieutenant Governor Casey Cagle. Brian Kemp at the time was Secretary of State. And in every single election since then, there has been, primarily speaking, a contested election. In 2022 was probably the more notable exception insofar that Herschel Walker had a field cleared for him in that Republican primary. But in every election since then, Georgia has faced a competitive race on the Republican side in terms of who people want to represent them on the GOP end. And the Republican Party in Georgia is rightfully worried that this Senate race will turn into a proxy war between Governor Brian Kemp, the incumbent Republican governor, and President Donald Trump. Now, Brian Kemp and Donald Trump have had their fair share of battles before. In 2020, we remember that it was Donald Trump who wanted to overturn the 2020 election results in the state of Georgia, to which Brian Kemp and Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger had denied his request, ultimately saying that wasn't going to fly. And then in 2022, Donald Trump decided to take it out on Brian Kemp. Rather than endorse him in the Republican primary as an incumbent, which he typically did in the majority of these states with GOP incumbents, he instead endorsed a primary challenger against Brian Kemp, to which that was David Perdue, the former U.S. Senator who had been representing Georgia from 2015 to 2021. And while the polling had indicated that this race was going to be a bit more competitive, Donald Trump's influence on the race really did not extend to the degree that it should have. David Perdue did not fundraise as much across the state. Brian Kemp had reeled in excessive amounts of cash, and Brian Kemp had maintained a level of popularity that really drove it home in this GOP primary. The data had suggested in the early stages that yes, Brian Kemp and David Perdue would likely face off in an inevitable runoff election against each other, especially with Donald Trump's endorsement in this race. But as they got closer to the primary season, in those final month and a half, 2 months that we saw in the state of Georgia, Brian Kemp pulled ahead, and by the time we reached the election, ended up blowing the race out of the water. The average said that Brian Kemp would defeat David Perdue by about 19.4%. Well, guess what? He won with 73.72% of the vote, over a 50-point margin in the state of Georgia. A massive, massive overperformance. And that speaks to the reach that Brian Kemp had in this state and the lack of reach that Donald Trump arguably had. This was probably one of the lower points of Donald Trump's political influence on the Republican Party, and it certainly was wavering. Around this time, there were heavy conversations around whether or not Donald Trump should even be the Republican nominee should he decide to run later that year, and obviously he was and would go on to win the presidential election. But around this time, Donald Trump's influence was a bit weaker. Now, it's a lot stronger. But Brian Kemp is still a notable figure in this state. He has practically nearly gone out here and said that Derek Dooley should be the Republican nominee for Senate here in the state of Georgia. I mean, we are finding that on the Republican side, Brian Kemp right now has already said that Derek Dooley's his guy. This is who he wants to run in the Georgia Senate race. Donald Trump has yet to make an endorsement, but we have an idea that he probably won't be choosing Brian Kemp's candidate. Both Buddy Carter and Mike Collins, two MAGA politicians through and through, have been very big advocates for Donald Trump in the Oval Office, had been very big advocates for him since he has been in elected office. And a big reason why that matters is because cozying up to Donald Trump is often how you get the endorsement from the President of the United States. Being close, whether by proximity or just simply in voting record, whatever it is, Donald Trump more often than not will choose those who he determines to be loyal to his base for elected office. And chances are that this Georgia Republican Party fear will come to reality. Donald Trump was not well viewed in the state of Georgia on the Republican side by people like Brian Kemp after a very big and contentious primary that ended up being a landslide for Brian Kemp. You see, the Republican Party was slightly worried that this would cause a rift. If the race was about 5 to 10 points, that Brian Kemp would come out of this with, a much more tainted general election candidacy, not to mention that the Republican Party would undoubtedly be fractured. But what this primary victory showed Brian Kemp was that he was able to tap into his constituency regardless of what Donald Trump was tweeting or posting 300 miles down south in Mar-a-Lago, right? And so thinking about this dynamic that has really developed in Georgia, it is Brian Kemp versus Donald Trump. The majority of the state does support Donald Trump, don't get that wrong, but a lot of them really like Brian Kemp. And so looking at this GOP primary, there arguably will be, equal weighted endorsements of Donald Trump's endorsement and Brian Kemp's endorsement, because I do think that Brian Kemp probably could survive a Republican primary if he had ran in this Senate race, and let's say Buddy Carter or Mike Collins ran against him. I think Brian Kemp would win the race. When you remove his name from the ballot, the endorsement carries weight, but it doesn't carry it to the same degree that his actual name on the paper ballot would actually do for Republican primary voters. And so I do think Derek Dooley stands to be at a reasonable chance of victory in this state. The betting market odds right now show it about, a two-way race for second place between Dooley and Buddy Carter. Mike Collins at about a 50% chance, but it fluctuates a lot. I mean, right, Derek Dooley wasn't even on the radar up until a few weeks ago. He was at 0%, not even in consideration. But the point is that this GOP primary is certainly expected to be contentious, and if it does go down the pathway of being Trump versus Kemp, it will only damage the Republican Party in the general election, because there isn't a Brian Kemp to make it through to the general to actually perform well against the inevitable Democratic nominee. And it's not as if this is a governor's race where Republicans have the incumbency status and it's Donald Trump choosing an incumbent to back. They're running against one of the nation's strongest Democratic contenders for U.S. Senate, and that is Senator Jon Ossoff, who in 2021 won despite everybody saying that he was going to lose. And when you take a look at the data that we have thus far, all of the polls say that Jon Ossoff against any of these candidates wins outright. He gets to the point where it's an easy victory and he wins by about 7 to 8 points. But here's the problem for the GOP. It isn't just polls, which often they write off and say they're fake news or they don't contribute anything. And I will be the first to say that the polls are not always right. They provide a general trend line here, and I think they are right in the early indications that Ossoff is the favorite right now. But putting that all aside, let's talk about fundraising numbers. Well, Derek Dooley obviously hasn't reported anything, and I doubt he has raised much. But based off what we've seen, Mike Collins and Buddy Carter seem to have raised upwards of around the same amount of cash. Around 2 to 3 million, probably in the last quarter, probably totaling up combined across the Republican candidates to around $10 million in the war chest. Jon Ossoff, on the other hand, stands to be the most fundraised candidate for Congress in the 2026 election, higher than any member in the House, any member in the Senate. He's already at $41 million raised. Now, if you remember how much he was able to raise back in 2021, you'll start to see why these fundraising numbers aren't actually that surprising. When you look at the data, which we can actually get to if we scroll past the polls and we get to the point in the runoff, the amount of money that was raised for Jon Ossoff was $156 million. It's like he won the Powerball or something, right? Looking at that sheer amount of cash, Ossoff certainly has the fundraising abilities in order to get to this point where he is able to win in this state. And a fractured Republican primary would only make a Democratic victory in a state that Donald Trump only won by 2 points that much more likely. Ossoff could have had a more competitive race, and certainly against somebody like Brian Kemp. But even taking Brian Kemp out of the equation, a competitive Republican primary is very difficult to maneuver as you go into a general election. Because it isn't just that these Republicans are going to disagree on economic policy or immigration policy or tariff, whatever it might be. I mean, these are real policy issues that can be debated and will be debated, but not to the degree that loyalty to Donald Trump will be the thing that matters above else. Derek Dooley is trying to play that card. His introduction ad has been about supporting Donald Trump and his presidency, but everybody sees through it. Dooley is the hand-picked candidate by Brian Kemp, who is at odds in every regard to Donald Trump. Mike Collins and Buddy Carter, on the other hand, have been advocates for Donald Trump in terms of their voting record, their public statements, their allegiances and fealty to the party and Donald Trump's Oval Office. These are things that the primary voters, who are often the most engaged and the most partisan / polarized, are going to see as positives in this GOP primary. And while in 2022, Brian Kemp, as a very popular Republican governor, was able to get through, I'm not that confident that Dooley will, because it's a three-way race and because of the fact that even if he does, it will not be without a scathing GOP primary against an otherwise popular Democratic incumbent who is running uncontested. So, what do we expect in 2026? This infight and the GOP's fears in Georgia will likely come to reality. This Trump versus Kemp proxy war has maintained itself since the 2020 presidential election, and I don't imagine that the first time that Donald Trump has the opportunity to really put his foot on the scale in a state like Georgia, that he will step back and allow Brian Kemp to have that sole endorsement in the race. And while Donald Trump does like to nominate people that win, and maybe Mike Collins and Buddy Carter are seen as less electable than Derek Dooley, my take is I think they all lose, either way, Donald Trump wants to have an impact on this race, and to the degree that he might, he will certainly try. And if he is able to even leverage his presidency, which he could, in favor of a political candidate, I have no doubt that he will move forward in doing so. Because this Trump versus Kemp relationship isn't great. While it has mended itself slightly since then, in the lead up to the 24 election, it wasn't amazing, and it doesn't stand to be amazing today. That's why the Georgia GOP fears such a competitive primary and fears that if this proxy war continues, it will only damage the candidates in the race rather than the incumbent Republican and the other incumbent Republican, the president and the governor. And as Brian Kemp eyes up a potential 2028 presidential election, this will be a test for him. How does Donald Trump engage with him, and how does he engage with his candidates? And chances are, I don't think he'll treat them kindly. So keep your eyes peeled on the 2026 race. These Republican candidates running for office. Donald Trump seems like he's going to choose somebody besides Brian Kemp's choice, but only time will tell how that actually comes to reality. But chances are, these fears are 1 or 2 weeks around the corner, with one Donald Trump Truth Social away from throwing this entire primary into a complete frenzy. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.